The hour between night and dawn is a peculiar one, where the world seems caught in a momentary hush, suspended in the in-between. It's a time when shadows stretch long, playing tricks on the mind, and the air hangs heavy with an eerie stillness. For most, it's a peaceful, solitary hour, but not for Lucas. That morning, standing alone on his porch with a cigarette between his fingers, he felt anything but calm. It was 7 a.m., the house behind him still dark, the rest of his family sound asleep in their beds. Only the soft rustling of leaves in the woods beyond his backyard broke the silence. At first, it was just another smoke break, a brief escape from the monotony of daily life. But then something changed. There's a subtle shift that happens just before terror strikes, a whisper in the air that tells you something is wrong, even if you can't see it yet. Lucas felt that shift deep in his bones as his eyes lazily scanned the tree line. The cigarette, now forgotten, burned slowly in his hand. A faint movement near the garage caught his attention. It was nothing at first, just a flicker, but it was enough to make his breath hitch. His gaze snapped toward the detached garage, an old structure that stood alone at the edge of the property, half hidden by shadows. The door, slightly ajar, creaked ever so faintly in the morning breeze. It was just enough to draw him closer in thought, even as dread began to coil around his heart. Something was in there. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. The kind of knowing that tightens your chest and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. The garage was a place he had walked by 1,000 times, a place that had never given him reason to feel unsettled. Until now. Now, it loomed in his vision, a yawning black void that seemed impossibly deeper than it had any right to be. He stood frozen, the cigarette falling from his hand, forgotten. Time seemed to slow, and the world around him shrank until all that existed was him, the garage, and the crushing weight of the unknown. For a moment, he couldn't move, his limbs heavy and unresponsive as though some invisible force had taken hold of him. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat reverberating in his ears like the tolling of a distant bell, warning him of something he could not yet see. Finally, as if shaking off a spell, Lucas fumbled for his phone. His hands trembled as he switched to the camera, the lens focusing on the faint gap in the garage door, the darkness beyond it swallowing the weak light of the early morning. The screen flickered, adjusting to the dimness, and then there it was, a face, pale, unnaturally so, floating in the blackness like something conjured from a nightmare. It appeared suddenly, jarringly, as though it had always been there, just waiting to be seen. The shock hit him all at once, a visceral punch that left him breathless. His skin prickled, the cold creeping into his veins as he stared at the figure, or rather, what should have been a figure. There was no body, no limbs, just a head, suspended in the gloom, staring blankly ahead. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It simply was, as though the shadows themselves had given it life. Lucas could feel the bile rising in his throat, a primal fear taking hold of him. The face was blank, devoid of any expression, yet it was somehow watching him. That much he knew. It wasn't just a trick of the light, wasn't just his imagination running wild. It was real. The pale skin, so stark against the backdrop of darkness, was wrong, impossibly wrong. His family, every one of them, had dark skin. Whoever or whatever this was, it didn't belong. It couldn't. And yet here it was, hovering silently in the space where there should have been nothing. The air grew colder, wrapping around him like icy fingers. His breaths came faster, shallower, as though the very act of breathing had become a monumental task. He tried to tear his eyes away, tried to tell himself that he was imagining things, that the early morning light was playing tricks on him. But he couldn't. The longer he looked, the more real it became, and the more certain he was that this was not a hallucination. This was not a product of his tired mind. This was something else, something worse. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the face began to retreat. It didn't disappear outright, but instead, it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, sinking deeper into the blackness until it was gone entirely. The garage door swayed ever so slightly, creaking on its rusty hinges as if mocking him. The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas stood there, frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing to comprehend what he had just witnessed. It felt as though hours had passed, though in reality, it had only been a few seconds. He should have felt relief, should have been glad that the face was gone. But he wasn't, because deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't left. It was still there, lurking just beyond his line of sight, waiting. Lucas forced himself to move, to take a step back from the porch, but the fear had already sunk its claws into him. He replayed the video, his hands shaking so badly that the phone almost slipped from his grasp. There it was again, the face. Just as clear, just as unsettling, staring back at him from the screen. He watched it over and over, hoping each time that he had been mistaken, that it wasn't real. But it was. Every time the pale, featureless face appeared, his stomach twisted in knots, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't dare go near the garage. The very thought of it made his skin crawl. There was something wrong with that place now. Something fundamentally wrong that had shifted in the moments he had stood there, cigarette in hand, staring into the abyss. And now, that wrongness clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. The sun was rising, casting long beams of light across the backyard, but the world felt no safer. If anything, the light only served to highlight how vulnerable he was, standing there in the open, with nothing but his phone and the creeping dread that had taken root in his mind. The garage door remained closed, but Lucas could still feel it, could still sense the thing lurking just beyond the door, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever it was that had shown itself to him, it had done so for a reason. It wanted to be seen, and Lucas had seen it. Now there was no going back, no pretending that everything was normal. That face would haunt him, not just in his dreams, but in every quiet moment, in every shadowy corner. Because once you've glimpsed the abyss, once you've seen what lurks in the darkness, it never truly leaves you.